Instantly surrounded and seized by the mob, Grant offered no resistance, but demanded to be led with his accuser before a magistrate. Almost as the words were uttered, a cry was raised that the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs were coming along East Cheap, and the prisoner and Leonard were immediately hurried off in that direction. They met the civic authorities at the corner of St. Clement's Lane, but instead of paying any attention to them, the Lord Mayor, who appeared to be in a state of great agitation and excitement, ordered the javelin men, by whom he was attended, to push the mob aside. "I will not delay your worship an instant," cried Leonard, "but this dreadful fire is the work of incendiaries, of whom that man," pointing to Grant, "is the principal. I pray your worship to question him. He may have important revelations to make." What?" cried the Lord Mayor, addressing Grant. "Is it true you are an incendiary? Who are your accomplices? Where are they?" "I have none," replied Grant, boldly. "I deny the charge altogether. Let my accuser prove it if he can." "You hear what he says, young man," said the mayor. "Did you see him set fire to any house? Did you find any fireballs on his person?" "I did not," replied Leonard. "I searched him, your worship," cried Challis, who was among the bystanders, the moment he was seized, "and found nothing upon him. It is a false and malicious charge." "It looks like it, I must say," replied the mayor. "On what grounds do you accuse him?" he added, angrily, to Leonard. "On these," replied Leonard. "He came to me 3 hours ago, and confessed that he had a desperate design against the safety of the city, and made certain proposals to me, to which I would not listen. This is not the season for a full explanation of the matter. But I pray your worship, as you value the welfare of the city, to have him secured." "There can be no harm in that," replied the Lord Mayor. "His appearance is decidedly against him. Let him be taken care of till the morrow, when I will examine further into the matter. Your name and place of abode, young man?" "I am called Leonard Holt, and my business is that of a grocer, in Wood Street," was the reply. "Enough," rejoined the mayor. "Take away the prisoner. I will hear nothing further now. Lord! Lord! How the fire rages, to be sure! We shall have the whole city burnt down, if we do not take care." "That we shall, indeed," replied Sir Robert Viner, one of the sheriffs, "unless the most prompt and decisive measures are immediately adopted." "What would you recommend?" cried the Lord Mayor, despairingly. Sir Robert looked perplexed by the question. "If I might offer an opinion," interposed Leonard, "I would advise your worship to pull down all the houses in the way of the fire, as the only means of checking it." "Pull down the houses," cried the Lord Mayor. "Who ever heard of such an idea? Why, that would be worse than the fire. No, no, that will never do." "The young man is in the right," observed Sir Joseph Sheldon, the other sheriff. Well, we shall see," replied the mayor. "But we are losing time here. Forward! Forward!" And while Grant was borne off to Newgate by a guard of javelin men, the Lord Mayor and his company proceeded to Fish Street Hill, where the whole conflagration burst upon them. The moment the Lord Mayor appeared, he was beset on all sides by hundreds of families soliciting his protection. Others came to give him the alarming intelligence that a very scanty supply of water only could be obtained, and that already 2 engines had been destroyed, while the firemen who worked them had narrowly escaped with life. Others again pressed him for instructions how to act, some suggesting one plan, some another, and being of a weak and irresolute character, and utterly unequal to a fearful emergency like the present, he was completely bewildered. Bidding the houseless families take refuge in the churches, he ordered certain officers to attend them, and affecting to doubt the statement of those who affirmed there was no water, advised them to go to the river, where they would find plenty. In vain they assured him the tide was out, the Thames water tower empty, the pipes and conduits dry. He would not believe anything of the sort, but upbraiding his informants with neglect, bade them try again. As to instructions, he could give none. At last, a reluctant assent being wrung from him by Sir Joseph Sheldon, that a house should be pulled down, as suggested by Leonard, preparations were instantly made for putting the design into execution. The house selected was about 4 doors from the top of Fish Street Hill, and belonged to a birdcage maker. But they encountered an unexpected opposition. Having ascertained their purpose, the owner fastened his doors, and refused to admit them. He harangued the mob from one of the upper windows, and producing a pistol, threatened to fire upon them if they attempted to gain a forcible entrance. The officers, however, having received their orders, were not to be intimidated, and commenced breaking down the door. The birdcage maker then fired, but without effect, and before he had time to reload, the door had yielded to the combined efforts of the multitude, who were greatly enraged at his strange conduct. They rushed upstairs, but finding he had locked himself in the room, left him there, supposing him secure, and commenced the work of demolition. More than 100 men were engaged in the task, but though they used the utmost exertion, they had little more than unroofed the building, when a cry was raised by those in the street that the house was on fire. Alarmed by the shout, they descended, and found the report true. Flames were issuing from the room lately occupied by the birdcage maker. The wretch had set fire to his dwelling, and then made his escape with his family by a back staircase. Thus defeated, the workmen, with bitter imprecations on the fugitive, withdrew, and Leonard, who had lent his best assistance to the task, repaired to the Lord Mayor. He found him in greater consternation than ever. "We must go further off, if we would do any good," said Leonard, "and as the present plan is evidently too slow, we must have recourse to gunpowder." "Gunpowder!" exclaimed the Lord Mayor. "Would you blow up the city, like a second Guy Fawkes? I begin to suspect you are one of the incendiaries yourself, young man. Lord, Lord! What will become of us?" "If your worship disapproves of my suggestion, at least give orders what is to be done," rejoined Leonard. "I have done all I can," replied the mayor. "Who are you that talk to me thus?" "I have told your worship I am a simple tradesman," replied Leonard. "But I have the welfare of the city at heart, and I cannot stand by and see it burnt to the ground without an effort to save it." "Well, well, I dare say you mean very well, young man," rejoined the Lord Mayor, somewhat pacified. "But don't you perceive it's impossible to stop such a fire as this without water, or engines? I'm sure I would willingly lay down my life to preserve the city. But what can I do? What can any man do?" "Much may be done if there is resolution to attempt it," returned Leonard. "I would recommend your worship to proceed, in the first place, to the wharves on the banks of the Thames, and cause the removal of the wood, coal, and other combustible matter with which they are crowded." "Well thought of," cried the Lord Mayor. "I will go thither at once. Do you stay here? Your advice will be useful. I will examine you touching the incendiary tomorrow, that is, if we are any of us left alive, which I don't expect. Lord, Lord! What will become of us?" And with many similar ejaculations, he hurried off with the sheriffs and the greater part of his attendants, and taking his way down St. Michael's Lane, soon reached the riverside. By this time, the fire had approached the summit of Fish Street Hill, and here the overhanging stories of the houses coming so close together as almost to meet at the top, the flames speedily caught the other side, and spread the conflagration in that direction. 2 other houses were likewise discovered to be on fire in Crooked Lane, and in an incredibly short space the whole dense mass of habitations lying at the west side of Fish Street Hill, and between Crooked Lane and East Cheap, were in flames, and threatening the venerable church of St. Michael, which stood in the midst of them, with instant destruction. To the astonishment of all who witnessed it, the conflagration seemed to proceed as rapidly against the wind, as with it, and to be approaching Thames Street, both by Pudding Lane and St. Michael's Lane. A large stable, filled with straw and hay, at the back of the Star Inn, in Little Eastcheap, caught fire, and carrying the conflagration eastward, had already conveyed it as far as Botolph Lane. It chanced that a poor Catholic priest, travelling from Douay to England, had landed that night, and taken up his quarters at the hotel above mentioned. The landlord, who had been roused by the cries of fire, and alarmed by the rumours of incendiaries, immediately called to mind his guest, and dragging him from his room, thrust him, half naked, into the street. Announcing his conviction that the poor priest was an incendiary to the mob without, they seized him, and in spite of his protestations and explanations, which, being uttered in a foreign tongue, they could not comprehend, they were about to exercise summary punishment upon him, by hanging him to the signpost before the landlord's door, when they were diverted from their dreadful purpose by Solomon Eagle, who prevailed upon them to carry him to Newgate. The conflagration had now assumed so terrific a character that it appalled even the stoutest spectator. It has been mentioned that for many weeks previous to the direful calamity, the weather had been remarkably dry and warm, a circumstance which had prepared the old wooden houses, abounding in this part of the city, for almost instantaneous ignition. Added to this, if the incendiaries themselves had deposited combustible materials at certain spots to extend the conflagration, they could not have selected better places than accident had arranged. All sorts of inflammable goods were contained in the shops and warehouses: oil, hemp, flax, pitch, tar, cordage, sugar, wine, and spirits, and when any magazine of this sort caught fire, it spread the conflagration with tenfold rapidity. The heat of the flames had now become almost insufferable, and the sparks and flakes of fire fell so fast and thick, that the spectators were compelled to retreat to a considerable distance from the burning buildings. The noise occasioned by the cracking of the timbers, and the falling of walls and roofs, was awful in the extreme. All the avenues and thoroughfares near the fire were now choked up by carts, coaches, and other vehicles, which had been hastily brought thither to remove the goods of the inhabitants, and the hurry of the poor people to save a wreck of their property, and the attempts made by the gangs of plunderers to deprive them of it, constituted a scene of unparalleled tumult and confusion. As yet, no troops had appeared to maintain order, and seeing that as much mischief was almost done by the plunderers as by the fire, Leonard determined to go in search of the Lord Mayor, and acquaint him with the mischief that was occurring. Having heard that the fire had already reached London Bridge, he resolved to ascertain whether the report was true. As he proceeded down St. Michael's Lane, he found the venerable church from which it was designated on fire, and with some difficulty forcing his way through the crowd, reached Thames Street, where he discovered that the conflagration had even made more fearful progress than he had anticipated. Fishmonger's Hall, a large square structure, was on fire, and burning swiftly, the flames encircling its high roof, and the turret by which it was surmounted. Streams of fire, too, had darted down the numerous narrow alleys leading to the riverside, and reaching the wharves, had kindled the heaps of wood and coal with which they were filled. The party under the command of the Lord Mayor had used their utmost exertions to get rid of these combustible materials by flinging them into the Thames, but they came too late, and were driven away by the approach of the fire. Most of the barges and heavy craft were aground, and they, too, caught fire, and were burned, with their contents. Finding he could neither render any assistance, nor obtain speech with the Lord Mayor, and anxious to behold the terrible yet sublime spectacle from the river, Leonard hastened to Old Swanstairs, and springing into a boat, ordered the waterman to row into the middle of the Thames. He could then discern the full extent of the conflagration, and trace the progress it was making. All the houses between Fishmonger's Hall and the bridge were on fire, and behind them rose a vast sheet of flame. St. Magnus Church, at the foot of the bridge, was next seized by the flame, and Leonard watched its destruction. An ancient gateway followed, and soon afterwards a large stack of houses erected upon the bridge burst into flames. The inhabitants of the houses on the bridge, having now become thoroughly alarmed, flung bedding, boxes, and articles of furniture out of their windows into the river. A crowd of boats surrounded the Starlings, and the terrified occupants of the structures above, descending to them by the staircases in the interior of the piers, embarked with every article they could carry off. The river presented a most extraordinary scene. lighted by the red and fierce reflection of the fire, and covered with boats, filled with families who had just quitted their habitations either on the bridge or in some other street adjoining it. Its whole surface was speckled with pieces of furniture, or goods, that had been cast into it, and which were now floating up with the tide. Great crowds were collected on the Southwark shore to watch the conflagration, while on the opposite side the wharves and quays were thronged with persons removing their goods, and embarking them in boats. One circumstance, noted by Pepys, and which also struck Leonard, was the singular attachment displayed by the pigeons, kept by the owners of several houses on the bridge, to the spots they had been accustomed to. Even when the flames attacked the buildings to which the dovecots were attached, the birds wheeled round and round them, until, their pinions being scorched by the fire, they dropped into the water. Leonard remained on the river nearly 2 hours. He could not, in fact, tear himself away from the spectacle, which possessed a strange fascination in his eyes. He began to think that all the efforts of men were unavailing to arrest the progress of destruction, and he was for a while content to regard it as a mere spectacle. And never had he beheld a more impressive, a more terrible sight. There lay the vast and populous city before him, which he had once before known to be invaded by an invisible but exterminating foe, now attacked by a furious and far-seen enemy. The fire seemed to form a vast arch, many-colored as a rainbow, reflected in the sky, and re-reflected in all its horrible splendor in the river. Nor was the aspect of the city less striking. The innumerable towers and spires of the churches rose tall and dark through the wavering sheet of flame, and every now and then one of them would topple down or disappear, as if swallowed up by the devouring element. For a short space, the fire seemed to observe a regular progressive movement, but when it fell upon better material, it reared its blazing crest aloft, changed its hues, and burnt with redoubled intensity. Leonard watched it thread narrow alleys, and firing every lesser habitation in its course, kindle some great hall or other structure, whose remoteness seemed to secure it from immediate danger. At this distance, the roaring of the flames resembled that of 1,000 furnaces. Ever and anon, it was broken by a sound like thunder, occasioned by the fall of some mighty edifice. Then there would come a quick succession of reports like the discharge of artillery, followed by a shower of fiery flakes and sparks blown aloft, like the explosion of some stupendous firework. Mixed with the roaring of the flames, the thunder of falling roofs, the cracking of timber, was a wild hubbub of human voices, that sounded afar off like a dismal wail. In spite of its terror, the appearance of the fire was at that time beautiful beyond description. Its varying colors, its fanciful forms, now shooting out in 100 different directions, like lightning flashes, now drawing itself up, as it were, and soaring aloft, now splitting into 1,000,000 tons of flame, these aspects so riveted the attention of Leonard, that he almost forgot in the sight the dreadful devastation going forward. His eyes ached with gazing at the fiery spectacle, and he was glad to rest them on the black masses of building that stood in stern relief against it, and which there could be little doubt would soon become its prey. It was now broad daylight, except for the mighty cloud of smoke, which o'er-canopied the city, creating an artificial gloom. Leonard's troubled gaze wandered from the scene of destruction to St. Paul's, an edifice, which, from the many events connected with his fortunes that had occurred there, had always a singular interest in his eyes. Calling to mind the denunciations poured forth by Solomon Eagle against this fane, he could not help fearing they would now be fulfilled. What added to his misgivings was, that it was now almost entirely surrounded by poles and scaffolding. Ever since the cessation of the plague, the repairs, suspended during that awful season, had been recommenced under the superintendence of Dr. Christopher Wren, and were now proceeding with renewed activity. The whole of the building was under repair, and a vast number of masons were employed upon it, and it was their scaffolding that impressed Leonard with a dread of what afterwards actually occurred. Accustomed to connect the figure of Solomon Eagle with the sacred structure, he could not help fancying that he discovered a speck resembling a human figure on the central tower. If it were the enthusiast, what must his feelings be at finding his predictions so fatally fulfilled? Little did Leonard think how the prophecy had been accomplished. But his attention was speedily called to the progress of the conflagration. From the increased tumult in the city, it was evident the inhabitants were now thoroughly roused, and actively bestirring themselves to save their property. This was apparent, even on the river, from the multitude of boats deeply laden with goods of all kinds, which were now seen shaping their course towards Westminster. The fire, also, had made rapid progress on all sides. The vast pile of habitations at the north side of the bridge was now entirely in flames. The effect of this was awfully fine. Not only did the flames mount to a greater height and appear singularly conspicuous from the situation of the houses, but every instant some blazing fragment fell with a tremendous splash into the water, where it hissed for a moment, and then was forever quenched, floating a black mass upon the surface. From the foot of the bridge to Coal Harbour Stairs, extended what Dryden finely calls a quay of fire. All the wharves and warehouses were in flames, and burning with astonishing rapidity, while this part of Thames Street, the lodge of all combustibles, had likewise become a prey to the devouring element. The fire, too, had spread in an easterly direction, and consuming 3 churches, namely, St. Andrew's, in Bodolph Lane, St. Mary's, in Love Lane, and St. Dunstan's in the east, had invaded Tower Street, and seemed fast approaching the ancient fortress. So fascinated was Leonard with the sight, that he could have been well content to remain all day gazing at it, but he now recollected that he had other duties to perform, and directing the waterman to land him at Queenhithe, ascended Bread Street Hill, and betook himself to Wood Street.